If you're a fairly new Mac user, you may have noticed that its keyboard is slightly different than on a PC. Instead of an Alt key, it's called Command, featuring a strange symbol resembling a cloverleaf. So what does this key mean, and why do Macs have it? Well, it goes back to before the Mac ever existed. It all started with the Apple III, which was meant to replace the wildly successful Apple II. Steve Jobs led the product's development and wanted to make the user experience more intuitive. Because remember, this was before the mouse and graphical user interface. Instead, command lines told the computer what to do, and these were often different depending on the program. To make things simpler, Jobs wanted to standardize as many commands as possible, leading the team to create two new command keys for the Apple III. The first was an outlined Apple logo, called the Open Apple key. It was used for universal shortcuts like copy and paste, which was Apple C and Apple V, commands we still use today. The second was a solid logo, called the Closed Apple key. It was used to quickly change things like system settings or display modes. Those keys helped improve the user experience of Apple III, but the product suffered from serious hardware failures like overheating and a $4,300 price tag that made it unaffordable for most consumers. So while the Apple III was a failed concept, its command keys were not, since the Closed Apple key was carried over to Steve Jobs' next project, the Lisa. Although he didn't have control over the key's implementation since he was eventually removed from the project. So Jobs moved on to the Macintosh, where he noticed something about its operating system he didn't like. When viewing commands from the drop-down menu, the team had included their corresponding shortcut, like Apple C for copy. That meant the Apple logo was repeated in almost every line of the menu. Jobs said, "There are too many apples on the screen. It's ridiculous. We're taking the Apple logo in vain. We've got to stop doing that." So to prevent the company's logo from losing its iconic allure, their graphic designer, Susan Kare, was given the task of creating a new icon for the command key. She favored symbols that mimicked real-life objects users could relate to. So Kare started off by experimenting with various objects that had commanding connotations, like a police badge, a whistle, and even the Ten Commandments. But none of them seemed to fit. Looking for inspiration, she began browsing through a symbol dictionary. And that's when Kare came across this symbol labeled feature. It was already being used in Nordic countries to indicate campsites or places of interest, although Kare imagined it could be interpreted as a cloverleaf highway, getting users where they wanted to go. So she presented it to the Macintosh team, who loved it, Jobs included. It was a distinctive symbol that could be rendered at a 16 by 16 pixel resolution. So it was added to the original Macintosh in 1984 and has been on every model since. But 2 years later, with Steve Jobs gone, Apple ran into a problem. They were creating a new keyboard that had to be compatible with both the old Apple II and the new Macintosh. That meant it had to have an Apple key and a command key. Luckily, they served the same function, so Apple just put both symbols on one key. Apple continued this hybrid command key even when Steve Jobs returned to the company, which was a bit surprising. Jobs wasn't afraid to cut Apple's product line to just 4 computers, and he allowed Jonathan Ive to design a radically new keyboard and mouse for the original iMac, but the command key stayed the same. Thinking back, this actually makes sense, because his original complaint wasn't about having Apple logos on the keyboard. He actually added 2 of them himself with the Apple III, but rather too many logos in the drop-down menus, a problem already solved with the original Macintosh. So for several years, Mac keyboards had featured a key with an Apple logo and a command symbol. That's why you might hear older Mac users today saying Apple C or Apple V for copy and paste, even though it's technically Command C and V. It wasn't until 2007 when Apple finally removed their logo from the key and added the word Command instead, making it much clearer to users what the button actually was. And while this may have upset some hardcore Apple fans, it was a necessary change. In the mid to late 2000s, Mac sales really started to take off, and most of those customers were switching from PCs. Its purpose just wasn't clear for new users, especially coming from Windows. Because PC keyboards have a Windows key featuring its logo, you press it and the Start menu appears. If this behavior is what you're used to, then you might expect the Apple key on a Mac to open a similar menu. Maybe the one with an Apple logo, literally called the Apple menu. But it didn't do that. It was also a bit strange that other modifier keys like Shift, Control, and Option had their names spelled out, while that wasn't the case for the Command key. So dropping the Apple logo from the Command key and replacing it with the word command helped clear up the confusion and left us with the design we're familiar with today. But why have this key at all? I mean, iPhone and iPad don't need it, so why do Macs? Well, it comes down to how we interact with and use each device. Part of the magic of iPhone and iPad was that their touchscreen interfaces eliminated the need for modifier keys. To copy and paste text, you just highlighted it with your finger and tapped the command. Special characters could be found just by holding down a letter. On a Mac, the Option key was used. And you didn't have to worry about quitting an application with Command Q, you just left the app when you were done with it. Today, Apple has implemented many of these features into macOS, making it possible to avoid using modifier keys for most tasks. But there's one huge benefit to using them: speed. When creating a keyboard case for iPad, Apple deliberately included Control-Option in Command keys, because while you can tap around on the screen to copy and paste text, it's much faster to use modifier key shortcuts, especially if you can touch type, or type on a keyboard without looking down. I mean, just think back to when Apple removed the MacBook Pro's Escape key and replaced it with the Touch Bar. It seemed like a good idea, but users complained endlessly that the software button made it impossible to know if a press registered or not, resulting in mistaps or duplicate taps. Users also couldn't rest their finger on it, making it less comfortable to use. So eventually Apple had to reintroduce the physical escape key, which proves that removing something like the command key would be disruptive to many users' workflows, even though it's not technically necessary. Now, in recent years, Susan Kerr shared stories about the command symbol, saying she wished it meant more instead of simply being an abstract shape. Well, her wish was granted. A man emailed her saying that in Scandinavia, the symbol was meant to resemble a castle with turrets, which turned out to be very appropriate imagery for a command key. This is Greg with Apple Explained. Thanks for watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next video.